Hello, I am Adeola Adejobi, along with my co-host, Jason Clark, and I want to welcome you to Raising the Bar with the MBBA.
The Metropolitan Black Bar Association is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our mission is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers. The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community, while also trying to identify some solutions in the process.
Today, we are going to take a deep dive into New York City's ban on discrimination based on hairstyles. Today's guests include attorneys Veronica Dunlap and James Hallman. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you.
Yes, well, this is actually exciting news. So if you can just provide us with a little bit more of an overview around the legal guidance that was just issued.
Again, thank you for having us, Adeola. So it's poignant that you phrased it as legal guidance because I've heard it described as a new law, right? And what this legal guidance actually does is seek to raise light and highlight prohibitions that are already in effect. So pursuant to New York City human rights law, discrimination on account of hair is something that already exists. It just hasn't been enforced and paid attention to. All right, so hair discrimination is something that permeates many different areas of law, including race, gender, religion, age, so on and so forth. And what this protection seeks to do is highlight those protections that already exist, and it recognizes that hair discrimination is something specifically that is something that affects Black people.
Right.
All right. So what's notable here is that CCHR, in issuing this guidance, they were very deliberate in pointing out the discrimination that Black people experience in the pursuit of employment and housing and in public spaces. So this is something, and I'll coin this phrase, and I don't know if it's been used and it might not be shared by others, but this really isn't all hair matters guidance. The guidance definitely takes note of those hairstyles that are specific to the Black culture.
And you said a CCHR. Can you define that just for the viewers so they know what that is?
The City Commission on Human Rights, which enforces the protections afforded by the New York City human rights laws.
Okay.
Great, thanks. And it's also great seeing, I think all of our guests have terrific hairstyles here today. So. But even before you get into some of these questions, like why now? Like why do you think it's today that this has happened as opposed to a few years ago? Like what do you think the impetus is that brought this specific protection to light?
So in New York, it isn't difficult to find Black men and women who have been discriminated against in subtle and in significant and substantial ways because of their hairstyles. And if you look at cases that have gone before the Supreme Court and they've refused to hear them, you'll find that there are no federal level protections with regard to hairstyle or hair texture. Also, in New York City, there have been recent complaints by employees in the Bronx, by an Upper East Side employee at a hair salon, and by employees at a Howard Beach restaurant in Queens, where hair discrimination was targeted at Black people. And so now is the time to enact this law and to enforce the guidance with employers.
And I'll just add to that because I want to make sure that the audience understands this and has the opportunity to take advantage of it. As I understand it, the head of the City Commission of Human Rights said that she and her staff watched a documentary called Back to Natural. And it's a documentary about how Black hairstyles have been used as a source of discrimination. And that also was behind kind of the impetus for this shift in this legal guidance.
Yeah, and so what protections are New Yorkers afforded under this law, or guidance?
Under the new guidance, employees are protected from employers who say that you have to pull your hair back or that you have to have styles that are professional with regard to locks, braids, twists, some typical African-American hairstyles, Bantu knots. And employees are also protected, schools, students in schools are protected from the same sort of discrimination, as well as public spaces like nightclubs and restaurants that have dress codes. They cannot deny entrance to a patron based on their natural hairstyle or texture.
So that's interesting that you say that, because I remember there was an article, I think it was earlier, I know in the last 6 months, where somebody, I think, was on a swim team, or was it a wrestling team?
Oh, he was a wrestler, and
right,
they made
wrestling.
and he had to cut his
and he
hair.
had to cut his hair to move forward with the match.
More specifically, his locks.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that was in New Jersey, so he wouldn't be protected under federal law or New Jersey law unless they were to have the same sort of guidance. But here in New York City, he definitely would have had recourse under the New York's guidance.
But when we say recourse, so now that something like that's and maybe that's a tricky question because that's a specific, unique situation. But if someone is told that they have to change their hair, and that it seems dramatic, where they had to literally cut the individual's hair, I mean, is the next step just bringing a lawsuit? Is the next step filing a complaint? Like, what would you recommend somebody do if they feel like their rights have been violated?
So if a member of the public feels that their rights have been violated, my recommendation would be to file a complaint or to attempt to file a complaint with the City Commission on Human Rights, which does have an enforcement arm which can investigate these instances of alleged discrimination and in some instances issue a fine up to $250,000.
Wow.
So we're talking heavy penalties here. In addition to that, for institutions that may have some of these discriminatory grooming policies and appearance policies and requirements, the City Commission on Human Rights can also seek that amendments be made to these policies to remove discriminatory requirements and references to requirements that people appear a certain way. So there's always coded language involved when you have these, right? It's not always overt. So what you want to look for is you want to look out for references to professional or neat and clean or clean shaved. So that's something that I would recommend. And in order to do that, members of the public can simply dial into 311 and ask for the City Commission on Human Rights if they don't have the number directly.
And I think viewers should also know that while the penalties can be levied against the employer or business up to $250,000, there is no cap on damages to plaintiffs who complain about being discriminated based on their hair.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, for so many folks, I mean, you could talk about it from a religious standpoint. You could, even if you're just talking about it from a cultural standpoint. Your hair is part of your personality and who you are. And I would imagine that some folks may be entitled to significant penalties and damages if they're essentially told to remove part of who they are as a person.
Yeah, can we talk about interviews? Because I think that's a big time where, people are a little bit nervous about, wearing their afro or wearing their hair natural. Are there any protections for someone who's not an employee yet?
Absolutely. The same protections apply. If you are an applicant at a business and you go to the interview and they say, do you intend to cut your hair if you work here? You are allowed to file a complaint with the Human Rights Commission because that is against the law for them to ask you to change your appearance, especially your hairstyle and hair texture, to be able to work there. So you don't have to be an employee in order to be protected under the new law.
Well, that's a great broad protection.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, Jason, that you mentioned how some people look at their hair as an extension of who they are. Because in the federal case that went before the Supreme Court, the 11th Circuit Court actually disagreed and said that under the law that there was no protection for hair because it's mutable. And for viewers, mutable means changeable. So they said you can change your hair. You can't change your skin color. You can't change your nationality. So it's not protected under the federal law. But now we have this guidance that clearly says it is an extension of yourself, and it's usually targeted at Black people. So,
right. Particularly for workplaces that want people to use chemicals in their hair in order to straighten their hair in a particular way.
Absolutely.
Right. So, but that's actually a very interesting distinguishing point. So we're saying that under federal law, there's not necessarily the same protection, but under state law there is. Is that what we're saying?
Not exactly.
Sorry. Okay.
Right, so,
Got it.
Right. So you have different levels of protection. You have federal law, you have your state law, and then you have the city law, right? So what I referenced earlier, the New York City human rights laws, that's where this lives, the protections for hair. So pursuant to the New York City human rights laws, which are enforced by the City Commission, you have these protections. So it's important that we keep in mind that these protections really live inside of New York City and are something afforded to its constituents, obviously, and employment situations and housing, and also with public accommodations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just so I'm making sure that at least the viewers get it, and I guess me too, but if we're talking about public or private businesses in New York, if we're talking about city agencies, but we're not talking about it for if someone works for the federal government, we're talking about a federal entity. Is that correct?
So just think about New York City as a whole, right?
Sure,
so for example, if we talk we talk about Nassau County. Nassau County is not a part of New York City.
Right.
So the protections wouldn't necessarily apply to instances or circumstances that occur in Nassau County.
Got it.
So you just want to think about the walls of New York City and where that jurisdiction essentially ends. That's for now. That's where the protections would end.
Yeah, so for clarity, any business within New York City.
Yeah, essentially,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And we're talking about employers really that I think that have more than 4 employees.
Okay.
And I mean, there are a lot of legal nuances of when a person is considered an employee and not an employee for a business. But just as a general matter of practice, we're talking most employers in New York City.
Right, and I know we talked about it specifically for employees and employers, but for schools, let's say a parent finds out that their child has been discriminated against based on their hair, what should they do?
The same thing. They can reach out to the Human Rights Commission's Legal and Law Enforcement Bureau to file a complaint. I think it's also notable that the guidance is not right now widespread, and a lot of people aren't really aware of it, but to go to the website and to download the PDF version of the guidance to sort of read through it and be able to understand what their rights are and what recourse they have when they're in situations like this.
Right.
So just expanding the conversation a little bit for a second, and this kind of goes to a point that James, you I think were alluding to earlier. So when we're talking about looking professional, when we're talking about dress codes, when we're talking about grooming, where is the line where someone may be able to say that we don't want you, we're not going to hire you, or we don't want you to continue in your employment because you're coming in a disheveled way or what have you, versus something that relates to your hair and your the other parts that are, I guess, yourself. I know all of this is, and it depends, and it gets messy and what have you, but with all that information, answer that for me the best you can.
Right, it's easy one.
Right.
No, not easy at all. I mean,
Right.
It's a very complex situation, and I think that there will be a lot of case-by-case situations moving forward that look to kind of interpret the requirements here. But at the end of the day, employees will have to be very careful and mindful and take a look very carefully at their grooming policies and appearance policies. What we really have to look at is whether there's a disparate impact on a certain race of people or a certain classification of people with whatever policy that exists. So if you have a policy that requires only black people to do something that other people aren't asked to do, there's going to be an issue, and that's what we really want to look at. So if you have this requirement that people look professional, but it really only applies to some people, then you have an issue. So the coded language, employees won't be able to hide behind the coded language for much longer in New York City.
Yeah.
I think it's important also to point out that employers still have the right to require some sort of changes for health and for safety purposes. So hair nets, beard nets, things of that sort. If you ask employees who have long hair to tie up their hair, you need to ask all of the employees with long hair, not just the people with braids or the people with locks. But if it's a policy that applies to everyone, I would say facially you can find that it's not discriminatory.
Okay, and that's a good point to really just be able to highlight that if the policy is relating to everybody, then that's different than what we're talking about here. And I'm sorry, it looked like you were going to say something, James.
Right, and I think there's just an additional caveat to that, right? Because when you have a policy that does require everyone to change something, the additional caveat is that the policy should look first to I guess whatever is less intrusive. So if you're asking everyone to change something, but there's a less invasive change that a person can make to satisfy whatever the requirement is. So if we're talking about a health or safety concern, you don't necessarily have to if you say, we need everyone to shave their beard. Well, if there's a way to, protect that beard and to keep that person safe, while they perform the essential functions of their job, then the CCHR, the City Commission, will require that be done instead of the extreme, shave your beard happen. So, that's just another level of where we're going with this.
Yeah, and so what can employers and schools do to make sure that they're compliant with the law?
I think it's a good idea to pull out those and dust off those professionalism and dress and grooming policies to have a look, compare them to the new guidelines, and make sure that there are no red flags that they should be taking out. But also, I think having a look at their staff and making sure that when they are deploying these sort of guidelines and policies, look at who's being impacted. And if it looks to you like it's just a particular group, maybe it's time to change your policies.
Additional advice that I would give employers is maybe when they do dust off those policies and take a look at them, it's probably best not to look at them in a vacuum, right? So you need to really consider and be mindful about who is looking at these policies with you. So I think that they need to have people that look like you and I in the room for that conversation to help drive the direction of that policy, because there are some things that are unconscious. Some of these policies that reference or hairstyles that we know and that Black people identify with, that employers might not just understand or might not understand how it ties to the Black culture, and that's what this policy looks to do. So it goes through the effort of like enumerating a number of hairstyles, right, that are related and historically connected to Black people. But it is clear in that it's not an exhaustive list. So it might be helpful to have some experts on Black hair in the room when you look at these policies.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, and I just have to think, again, I made allusion to this in the beginning, but, everyone here has, some really terrific hairstyles, at least in my personal opinion. And, but even with that, we've all had circumstances, growing up, even myself, where people have said something about your hair, or they've, you've been able to see those nuances. To the extent you feel comfortable, are there any stories or any circumstances that you can share so that someone else who may be watching this who has dreadlocks, or someone else who has, their natural hair, could be able to identify, what circumstances to look for, so if that happens to them or someone that they know that there's an actionable complaint?
I remember an instance, before I was a lawyer, I was a professional dancer, and I remember an instance right before the season began where I was the only one in the company. I had a very short afro, and everyone else had very long hair or extensions that were very long. And there was a particular performance where the women had to toss their hair from side to side, and everybody had the long hair going side to side, and my little baby afro was just not going very far. And I was fine with that. And after rehearsal, one of the directors and the company owner pulled me aside and said, "We'd like you to get extensions so that you look the same as everybody else during the performance. It's going to mess up the performance if you don't do that." And at the time I was very young, but I felt like it was wrong that they asked me to sort of change my appearance. And they said, "You can get these extensions." And so I didn't really stand up for myself that much, but I did say to them, "Well, if you want me to get the extensions, they cost $200. So you can pay for them and I'll get them. But if not, it's going to be me and my fro on the stage." And it was me and my fro on the stage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think these are probably, I would guess that these are the type of situations that we're trying to protect from happening in the future moving forward.
Absolutely. Under this guidance, they should not have asked me at all to change my hair.
Right, yeah.
And I think, you and I touched on this a little bit already, Jason. We need another show for me to kind of highlight and dive into, things that I've experienced. But I will share, one experience so I can recall my days as a litigator. And I remember preparing for a trial in the Eastern District at one point, and a colleague of mine suggested that I cut off all of my facial hair for trial. And I asked him why, and he said, well, jurors generally don't trust people with facial hair. And I remember thinking long and hard about it, and obviously I didn't do it. But I realized that the problem wasn't me, and it wasn't the facial hair. It was the fact that maybe I'm not before a jury of my peers. Because if I were, a jury of my peers would understand why I have facial hair, and they wouldn't be threatened by it. So I realize, and I think my advice to the viewers would be, to do what you can and to certainly continue to be your authentic selves, because at the end of the day, your hairstyle, your hair color has nothing to do with your ability to perform the functions of a job.
Yeah, and I think that's an amazing point there, because I could imagine there's somebody there who may be watching or thinking like, why is this that important? Why do we need like a particular protection out here for this? But in addition to it just being important on its face value, I mean, this has implications to larger systems of discrimination out there, and by trying to tackle, I would imagine, some of these these incremental steps, they could kind of increase our ability as a society to be able to reduce some of these larger inequities that we see in all the systems, whether it's the criminal justice system that you're talking about, which we all know there needs to be some improvements on, whether we're talking about schools and education. There are some large effects that this can have, which I think are maybe a little that are nuanced that people may not be seeing, but can have some great ramifications moving forward.
Yeah, and so what do you all think is going to be the impact of this new guidance?
Yeah.
I think partially what Jason just said. I think he just gave us the overview there. So I won't repeat what you said, because I think you hit the nail on the head there. But I will say that New York has always been a leader in pushing a progressive agenda forward that looks to protect all people, and in not only the public space but in private spaces, reaching behind those doors and saying, we want to do right by everyone. And I think that this will help cities around the country to take a look at their own protections and policies, especially given that the Supreme Court decided not to hear the 11th Circuit case that said hair is not an extension of ourselves.
Right. And so we only have 5 minutes left, but can you remind our viewers about where they can go and download and read the guidelines, just in case they missed that?
Right. So, just a quick Google search, the New York City Commission on Human Rights. The legal guidance is there. They'll find a press release that they can print out that also just gives some context into why this is important, why now, who the players are, and obviously it lays out the methodology in which they can file complaints. All right. So we want to remember that in addition to the CCHR, as I stated at the outset, these protections are based on laws that already exist, and the protections go beyond just the basis of race. So this applies to cases where, for religious reasons, people have long hair or other styled hair. Age discrimination cases have had hair implications. Disability cases have had hair implications. So there are already systems in place for filing complaints of this magnitude. But certainly, the City Commission on Human Rights is the place to start.
Yeah.
They can also just dial 311 and ask to be connected to the CCHR. And they can look for the hashtag YourHairYourRight NYC on Twitter and social media to see more information about the guidance, and to also see other people who are showing their hair proudly and loudly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I saw the new guidance came out recently, I was very excited about it. You know, I usually wear my hair straight to interviews, and then, you know, a few months later, you'll see a fro. But it's good to know, because I think particularly for women of color, Black women, you're always afraid that, you know, you don't want to give an interview a reason not to hire you.
Right.
So you're like, let me just take hair out of the equation and not think that, hey, if I don't get this interview, was it based on my hair or what I look like or who I am, really?
Absolutely, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would only add to that, Adeola, that, you know, let's be clear, right? You know, so when you interview for a job, employees are not really transparent that, you know, they didn't select you as a candidate because of your hair.
Right.
All right? You're not going to get a rejection letter that says your hair was too loud and therefore we didn't select you. So I think that, candidates will have to, certainly inform themselves and be mindful of some flags, during interviews and pay attention to some of the signs because it's still going to be, their responsibility to kind of, identify and be aware of when, hair discrimination might be occurring.
So I'm just wondering, for me, I come in with my hair straight and then a few months I change my hair. Could an employer say that, well, you presented yourself one way and now you look another way and we don't want you to work here anymore?
My answer to that would be no. Right? So again, going back to one of my earlier remarks, hairstyle has nothing to do with your ability to do the job and to perform the essential functions of the job. So just because your hairstyle changed, it doesn't mean that you don't know the things they thought you knew when they decided to offer you the job in the first place. And back to Veronica's point, I think that with this guidance, the commission is saying that it recognizes that hairstyle is immutable. Despite the fact that maybe the federal courts and the state courts haven't yet, got on board with the idea that Black people can't just, just because you can change your hair, it doesn't mean that your race changes. The city commission says no. It says that Black hairstyles is essentially a part of your race, and you can't just change your race as the days change.
Right.
Well, at this point, it's the end of our show, but I want to thank our guests, James and Veronica, for being here with us and telling us about these are important protections that are here for us.
Thank you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA. To watch our other shows, you can visit mnn.org. Until next time, goodbye.